B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, News and Comment. It's Thursday, October 17th, 2019. Impeachment and related matters top our news and comment today, with a reminder to listeners who listen to the podcast right away, on day one, that on Friday evening at 8 o'clock Eastern Time, I will be appearing on Consortium News Live. CN Live is a weekly live stream video show. It airs at 8 p.m. Eastern on Friday evenings, and I engaged in a lively discussion with a panel that included Scott Ritter, the former UN weapons inspector, who's been a guest on this podcast, Scott Horton of antiwar.com, and The Scott Horton Show, who has also appeared on this podcast. And, of course, moderators Joe Lauria and Elizabeth Voss presided. And it was a discussion that goes on for, I think, 90 minutes, maybe even a little longer. We touched on a lot of issues related to impeachment. And it's fascinating because I ended up being the one who says, well, there is something there with Ukraine-gate. Both Ritter and Horton dismiss it. And Joe Lauria believes that it is a kind of a backfire lit to protect Democrats from possible revelations from the Bill Barr and John Durham investigation of the origins of Russiagate that's underway right now. So you'll find a lot of healthy exchanges. And Scott Ritter is a guy I deeply respect. He is a Reagan Republican, as he talks about in the roundtable discussion. And he brings important perspectives. He thinks that impeachment is going to be very divisive, and he worries that it could provoke violence. And from his perspective, he believes that the current approach, dominated by the Ukraine narrative, is not based on the rule of law. And I countered that the rule of law issues, I think, are pretty clearly violated in the Michael Cohen plea deal over the hush money paid to Stormy Daniels. And I can never remember her name, the Playboy playmate who said she had an affair with Trump. And Scott Ritter also made a kind of plea for bipartisanship that I sort of batted down. And we also got into a lengthy discussion about Rudy Giuliani and his role in the current explorations, Sherlock Holmes style. And I highly recommend, if you watch it, make sure you see the section where Scott Horton goes full-on anti-war. And he argues that not only should Trump be impeached for the war in Yemen, for war crimes, but so should Obama and George W. Bush and Bill Clinton. And while you may find that extreme, Scott Horton makes a strong case for each of those individuals to be impeached. And as I go into the impeachment coverage here today at the top of the podcast, I'll make a few other comments related to the CN Live roundtable discussion. And I hope you do find a chance to either view it on Friday night, or it'll be available on YouTube and at consortiumnews.com as a recorded video whenever you choose to access it. So, a bizarre scene at the White House today. As the permanent acting chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney's been in the job since January, and there doesn't appear to be any plan to make him permanent or to boot him out of there. He took breath away from many reporters when he admitted that Trump blocked about $400 million in military aid into Ukraine, in part to force the government in Kyiv to investigate his political rivals. The Washington Post, in its newsy article, says a startling acknowledgement after the president's repeated denials of a quid pro quo. Now, in the Consortium News discussion, Joe Lauria himself made a strong case that American presidents have long leveraged payouts, support, military aid for other governments with political demands. And Mulvaney said that this maneuver is absolutely appropriate. He went on to say, did he, Trump, also mention to me in the past the corruption related to the DNC server? Absolutely no question about that. But that's it. That's why we held up the money. Now, I'm puzzled by this, what is obviously a strategic initiative from the White House. Mulvaney talked to reporters at the same time as Gordon Sondland was testifying or answering questions before the impeachment investigators over on Capitol Hill. Is this simply a competing narrative? To give Fox News something to chew on and ignore Sondland? I don't know. But I cannot fathom why Mulvaney would make this kind of an admission. He went on to say that the funds have been withheld because European countries were being really, really stingy when it comes to lethal aid. Now, maybe the lethal part is the qualifier, but from my knowledge, European nations have given Ukraine over $16 billion in aid. Now, I don't know that it's all or even part military aid. And he told us that we should just get over it. I have news for everybody. Get over it. There's going to be political influence in foreign policy. Elections have consequences, and they should, and your foreign policy is going to change. There's no problem with that. But what about the emerging quid pro quo? In the CN Live roundtable, I make the point that Trump is a clever enough grifter that in the July 25th phone call, I don't believe he quite crossed the line into quid pro quo. But the discussions of his appointees, including the freelance team led by Rudy Giuliani, indicate clear linkage. Zelensky of Ukraine was not going to be invited to visit the White House unless he announced an investigation that would include the Bidens. And so this is quite a scene. And it plays out after Trump's alleged meltdown in a meeting with Democratic leaders yesterday. We'll get to that. But here is the topper. Before Mulvaney admitted the quid pro quo, he announced jubilantly that President Trump will host next year's G7 meeting at Trump Doral, his luxury resort near Miami. And Mick Mulvaney gave a sales pitch just like the one Trump gave at the last G7 meeting where he said, "Come on down to Miami, guys." Mulvaney said, "It's almost like they built this facility to host this type of event." The facilities, the location, all of this is just perfect. And he said that the issue is not a conflict of interest. Now, this clearly raises more questions about violations of the Constitution's emoluments clause. And the only remedy for a constitutional violation by a president is impeachment. And while Mulvaney can deny that there is a conflict of interest, he went on to say the president has made it clear since he's been here that he hasn't profited since he's been here. Well, he can say that. But we know Ivanka has received her share of profits from the Trump Washington International Hotel. And we know that foreign governments have been patronizing that hotel to show their loyalty to Trump. It is a disgusting form of casual corruption. I heard Rush Limbaugh denouncing critics of this on his radio show this morning. Just wiping it away, saying, come on, who cares? And it is stunning how this has become a new normal. So Gordon Sondland is this guy who gave Trump $1 million and bought himself the ambassadorship to the European Union, which does not include any jurisdiction over Ukraine. And he was up on the Hill today. Again, there was the maneuver. They tried to block his testimony. The subpoena was issued, and Sondland did appear. So the stone wall that Trump has built, like the one on the southern border, is mostly non-existent. There are now 6 people who have tread this path of defying the order not to appear and submitting to a subpoena. So Sondland is covering his ass. In his prepared statement, we don't know what other questions might be put to him. We have to wait for the leaks tomorrow. He said that Secretary Perry, Ambassador Volker, and I were disappointed by our 23rd of May meeting and a White House debriefing. We strongly believe that a call and White House meeting between Presidents Trump and Zelensky was important and that these should be scheduled promptly and without any preconditions. Sondland added, we were also disappointed by the president's direction that we involve Giuliani. Our view was that the men and women of the State Department, not the president's personal lawyer, should take responsibility for all aspects of U.S. foreign policy toward Ukraine. And what's interesting in the CN Live conversation, my friend Joe Laria went to great lengths to dismiss John Bolton as completely not credible as an objector to the injection of Giuliani into the Ukrainian-American relations. But then he went on to defend Rudy Giuliani for freelancing as a Sherlock Holmes on behalf of Trump. I think you'll find the conversation very interesting. So more from Sondland. I did not understand until much later that Giuliani's agenda might have also included an effort to prompt the Ukrainians to investigate Biden or his son, or to involve Ukrainians directly or indirectly in the president's 2020 re-election campaign. So this is a big cover-your-ass moment. I can't wait for the leaks of what kinds of questions he got and how he responded to them. And over at the New York Times, coverage of Sondland notes his account is at odds with testimony from some foreign policy officials who have portrayed Sondland as willingly inserting himself into Ukraine policy, despite the fact that the country is not within the purview of his posting. And separately, the Washington Post revealed that Sondland spent $1 million of taxpayer money to refurbish whatever housing he has in his status as the ambassador to the European Union. So next up in the pipeline for the House investigators, 2 Pentagon officials, Laura Cooper and Catherine Wheelbarger, and 2 top White House budget officials, Russell Vought and Michael Duffy, who will address the questions of the decision to freeze that security aid for Ukraine. And down the line, we expect to hear from Bill Taylor, the acting ambassador who took the job after Maria Yovanovitch, I think is her name, was abruptly removed by Trump. So this is going to continue to play out on a daily basis, and I have reduced some of my skepticism, not of using this Ukraine issue as the basis for impeachment, but there does appear to be much more to the story than what initially surfaced. And we see the broad use of Rudy Giuliani and his potential abuse of his status with Trump to generate revenues for Giuliani Inc. Also, we get the leaked information from yesterday's performance by Michael McKinley. Until last Friday, he was the number 2, the Deputy Secretary of State to Mike Pompeo. And while he did take a swipe at working for Rex Tillerson and appeared to like Mike Pompeo, he described his mounting frustration with how politicized the State Department has become under Trump, and that the last straw for him was the ouster of Marie Yovanovitch, that former ambassador that I mentioned. And McKinley said he was also alarmed at how poorly diplomats are being treated and the political wing in the State Department that's been accusing some career diplomats of not having sufficient political loyalty to Trump. I never thought of Mike Pence or Mike Pompeo as peacemakers, but they're going to be able to claim that glow for at least a few days. They went to Ankara, Turkey. They had a lengthy meeting with President Erdogan after he suggested he might not meet with them. And we are told that they hammered out a 5-day ceasefire in Syria that will permit the Kurdish fighters to withdraw. Now, I don't know exactly where they're going to withdraw to, and if they have to cross Turkish or unclaimed Syrian territory, what kind of other complications might arise. And the plan is that following the completion of the withdrawal, Turkey's military operation would be halted entirely, according to Pence. He said that they have communicated with the Syrian Kurdish militias, and we have already begun to facilitate their safe withdrawal. The Trump administration has also agreed not to impose the new sanctions and to withdraw the ones that were imposed earlier this week. Congress is now separately threatening to impose sanctions, but they could be vetoed by Trump. Now, Erdogan got the removal of the militias, the end of a threat of sanctions, and we will see if he keeps his word. And fundamentally, if Trump, with the intervention here of Pence and Pompeo, can prevent a massive slaughter of the Kurds, it will be to their advantage, and it will vindicate, to some extent, Trump's decision to withdraw the measly 1,000 troops that we have in Syria today. Now, there were two other developments yesterday. The House took a vote overwhelmingly objecting to Trump's Syria policy, including over 100 Republicans, and that the corporate media continues to demonize Trump as the man who abandoned the Kurds and destabilized the region, and he's just all around foolish for it. And as you know, if you're a regular listener, I'm loath to say anything good about Donald Trump. And while he used really bad tactics and impulsive moves to execute the impending withdrawal of U.S. forces from Syria, I believe he did the right thing. And at Consortium News today, Graham E. Fuller, who's a former CIA fairly high-level official, and a guy who I have some qualms about, notably his role in the Boston bombing investigation, his links to the uncle of the Tsarnaev brothers, and his other tasks when he worked for the company. But I can separate that from smart analysis, and I recommend that you read Graham Fuller's piece. He said the bottom line is, after 8 years of civil conflict, the situation in Syria is basically reverting to the pre-conflict norm. The Syrian government is now close to reestablishing sovereign control over the entire country. Indeed, that control had been vigorously contested by the U.S., Israel, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and many proxy fighters from unidentified nations, mostly in that region. He goes on to say the U.S. has been trying to covertly overthrow the Syrian regime off and on for 50 years. When the Arab Spring broke out in Syria in 2011, it was hoped that it would overthrow Assad, but it didn't, due in part to his brutal put-down of rebel forces, and in part because large numbers of Syrian elites feared that whoever might take Assad's place could be far worse, like another jihadi group. And over this entire time, the U.S. has been willing to support almost any motley array of forces, including extremist jihadi forces linked with al-Qaeda, to try to overthrow Assad. Washington has never gotten over the fact that Syria, for over half a century, has never bowed to U.S. or Israeli hegemony in the region. Ironically, if the civil war with its massive foreign support to the rebels had not been so prolonged, Assad might not have needed Russian or Iranian support and presence. So we reap what we sow. And it's important to remember Assad still represents the internationally recognized, legitimate, if often nasty and harsh, government of Syria. And then he basically peels the onion and breaks down some of the layers related to Syria. He says, I believe that Trump is justified in pulling out U.S. forces as part of an ongoing process of bringing a gradual end to Washington's endless wars. The war no longer served any real purpose except to destabilize Syria. He says, whose narrative you choose to identify with in this mess depends on what your agenda is in Syria. If you favor the Israeli agenda, keep Syria permanently weak, divided, and without allies. Do anything that will hurt Iran. Maintain Israel as the dominant Middle Eastern power. So I think this is a very strong piece, and I mostly agree with his analysis. I hope you'll take a look. Separately, Rick Sterling, who I know is a devotee of the late Robert Parry. I met him at one of the memorial services for Bob. He writes over at Global Research, if one believes in restoring international law and the UN Charter, it is good that U.S. military forces are being withdrawn from northern Syria. Basic fact, it's not our country. U.S. troops were never authorized by the government to be there. Obama originally said putting boots on the ground in Syria would be a profound mistake, and later he said we have a very specific objective, one that will not lead into boots on the ground or anything like that. But Sterling notes the Hawks prevailed. There were not only boots on the ground, there was a shifting rationale why they had to be there. He goes on, the U.S. encouraged the emergence of the Islamic State because it put pressure on Damascus and because it justified the entry of the U.S. And after we spent billions behind the phony Free Syrian Army, the moderate rebels, they gave the militias the new name of the Syrian Democratic Forces and continued to push for the downfall of Assad. And he closes by noting Joe Biden's comment in this week's Democratic debate that the withdrawal of U.S. troops from northern Syria was the most shameful thing any president has done in modern history. But Sterling points out that Joe Biden was an influential supporter of the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and he supported the overthrow of the Libyan government. Both highly shameful episodes, and I agree with Sterling's comment on that. Every day I pause for a second to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. And I want to remember Forbes Johnson. He's a generous supporter who's come through, and this computer that I'm talking to you through right now was funded in part by Forbes' generosity. Also want to thank Aaron Jacobs and Lauren Christine and Aidan McAleer, who are subscribers who have recently chipped in as much as $5 in American cash. And if you're able to do that too, I would accept your generosity in my direction. Visit peterbcollins.com, click menu, click Become a Subscriber. You hit the sign-up page, and in just a jiffy, you can decide what level of support is comfortable for you and your budget. And I want to mention, if you take out a new annual subscription for $50, that's our best deal. I have one more copy of Dr. Justin Frank's Trump on the Couch. Be happy to send it your way with a new annual subscription. So I mentioned the meeting in the White House yesterday. It was after the House had passed this resolution condemning Trump for his moves in Syria in the last 10 days. And as you know, I think that this is grossly exaggerated. There's opportunism for political purposes to put Trump on the defensive. And it works. So Pelosi, Schumer, other Democrats march over to the White House, and apparently they were invited by the White House. But when they got there, Trump said, they said you wanted this meeting. I didn't want this meeting, but I'm doing it. Several lawmakers replied that the White House had reached out to them in an effort to brief them on the administration's Syria policy. Trump then began a speech about that nasty letter he sent to President Erdogan of Turkey. It is bizarre. The tone of it, so condescending, so, how can I put it, inappropriately familiar and just stupid. So Pelosi then said that the House had passed the resolution with overwhelming Republican support, and Trump and then Chuck Schumer, the Senate Minority Leader, tried to appeal to Trump as a fellow New Yorker. And I said, being from New York, we're particularly aware of the problems that terrorism and an organization like ISIS can create. And then he quoted General Mattis, that the danger of ISIS is so much greater. And at that point, Trump interjected, saying Mattis was the world's most overrated general. You know why? He wasn't tough enough. I captured ISIS. Mattis said it would take you 2 years. I captured them in 1 month. He did? I don't recall any daring do by our stable genius. Anyway, then Pelosi tweaked him by saying that Russia has always wanted a foothold in the Middle East, and there was Trump, all roads with him lead to Putin. And then Trump, in a neener mode, said, I hate ISIS more than you do. And Pelosi responded, you don't know that. And then Trump said, you're just a politician. Pelosi, sometimes I wish you were. And then turning to Pelosi, you're not a politician, you're a third-grade politician. Some people heard it as third-rate, but I don't know, I wasn't there. So the meeting broke up pretty shortly after that, and Pelosi went to the microphone saying that Trump had had a meltdown. And later, Trump took to Twitter, where he can always find a friend, and he wrote, Nancy Pelosi needs help fast. There is either something wrong with her upstairs or she just plain doesn't like our great country. She had a total meltdown in the White House today. It was very sad to watch. Pray for her. She's a very sick person. Now, this is projection because Trump is recycling the comments that Pelosi made at the White House microphone, saying that the president is sick, that Americans should pray for him, and suggesting that he was mentally unstable. Just so weird. But it gets weirder. Yesterday, Trump found time to stage an ambush meeting in the White House. He invited the grieving parents of a British teen who was run over by a car in Britain. He was riding a motorcycle. And the woman behind the wheel was an American who is the wife of a U.S. diplomat. She claimed diplomatic immunity, left Britain, and has faced no consequences for the accident that took this young man's life. So Trump invited the parents, and their names are, Tim Dunn and Charlotte Charles. So they go into the Oval Office, and Trump drops a little bombshell. He says that the woman who drove the car that killed their son, Ann Sakulis, was in the next room and asked if they were willing to meet with her. And the man who was shepherding the parents, whose name is Seeger, what's his first name here? Rad Seeger. He said, no, Mr. President, that's not why we're here. And I'm glad to see somebody who would stand up to Trump and reject this crazy idea. He said, if we're ever going to do this, it's going to be in England when she is going through the court system. Now, I support restorative justice, victim-offender reconciliation. But this is not the right way to do it. And the ugliest part about this is that Trump, kind of like, what was that old show where people were sequestered off stage in a soundproof booth? I can't remember which one it was. It was a game show. Anyway, Trump had cameras, media representatives, in a third room. So he's got the grieving couple, he's got the woman accused of killing their son in room number 2, and then in room number 3, reporters ready to pounce and roll cameras for the emotional exchange that, fortunately, didn't happen. This is really gruesome. And I don't think it's an impeachable offense, but it's an offensive offense. Now, Trump says he held the meeting at the request of Boris Johnson, his counterpart in Britain. And as I said yesterday, I do not comprehend this new Brexit deal that they have announced. But Boris Johnson announced the deal, and he had the president of the European Union to back him up, saying that there is no possibility of an extension. So today's Thursday. Saturday, there's supposed to be a House of Commons vote on this revised Brexit deal that has these incomprehensible shifts to the Irish backstop and the customs border in the middle of the Irish Sea. I'm sure it'll make sense someday, but it doesn't make sense to me today. But then the president of the European Union was overridden by the leaders of the 27 other European nations. And they said, basically, if the vote fails in the parliament on Saturday, they will grant an extension. Now, Boris wanted a no-exit approach here to this vote. He wanted to lock the doors of Parliament, say this is your last chance, and force them to hold their noses and vote for it. But we're learning that the leader of the critical Northern Ireland Party has said that they won't back this. And then Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour leader, said that this deal is worse than the one that was rejected after being presented 3 times by Theresa May. So based on the optics here, the confusion reigns. And we will simply have to wait and see how it plays out. At the Democratic debate in Ohio the other night, there was a little duel between Andrew Yang and Elizabeth Warren. Andrew Yang makes the case that Americans need to be prepared for manufacturing jobs to be mostly conducted by robots, and that automation is what has led to job losses in the last, say, 20 years. And I want to thank Public Citizen because they dove into the data, and they show that since 2000, we have lost 5 million U.S. manufacturing jobs and that 1 in 5 factories has closed. And claims that automation caused the job loss are premised on misinterpretation of the data. Basically, productivity increased even as the employee counts were sharply reduced. And so they make the case that in 1970, the U.S. had 17 million manufacturing jobs. In 2000, 17.2 million. And after the decline starting in 2000, we reached a new low in 2006, and I don't have the actual number there, but it is described as much lower than 17 million. So it was really during the Bush years that the job losses occurred, and trade deals appear to be much more of a driver than domestic automation. Also, in reaction to the performance of Mayor Pete at the debate on Tuesday night, the American Prospect, under the byline of Alexander Salmon, takes a look at the new Mean Pete. And they describe the way he came on the scene as charming, as a guy who was a nice guy, Democrat, in a red, deindustrialized state, a guy who was trying not to dirty his nose in the arena of partisan politics. He condemned incivility and disunity. But as the campaign has unfolded, Charming Pete has all but disappeared, replaced by a more combative, defiant Pete, whose new M.O. is scoring points by attacking the Democratic Party's progressives from the right on everything from gun control to campaign finance to health care. There's more. You can follow the link in the show file to pick up more of that article about Pete Buttigieg. A few details coming to light about the General Motors Auto Workers tentative agreement. It's a little disappointing because the auto workers were trying to keep plants open, reopen plants that have been recently shuttered, and they achieved 1 out of 3. The Hamtramck near Detroit plant of GM will remain open. They got a 3% wage increase in the second and fourth years, a 4% lump sum bonus in the first and third years, a shortened path to permanent status for the full-time temporary workers to try to narrow the gap between the two-tier system that came in after 2009. No change to the health care plan, no additional copays for employees, and so we'll see. I think it's likely to be ratified by the rank and file. The Guardian is exposing the latest effort to shut down criticism of Israel by Americans. Pro-Israel and conservative lobbyists are working now with ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Committee, to get state-level laws passed that declare that criticism of Israel is de facto anti-Semitic. This is deeply offensive to people who are offended by true anti-Semitism. One of the leaders of this effort is a Republican from Florida named Randy Fine. He is a legislator there. He's faced controversy over his aggressive opposition to public debate about Israel. Earlier this year, he called a local Jewish constituent a Judenrat because the man had attended a forum, Palestine-Israel Opening the Dialogue. And that is a loaded term back from the Nazi era of the councils in Jewish ghettos. Now, if you're a regular listener, you know that this is an ongoing problem. This conflation of criticism with Israel and anti-Semitism is deeply offensive, and it's a clear violation of our First Amendment rights. But get this. This guy Fine says that under the new laws, anti-Semitism on campus will be treated identically as to how racism is treated. And Students for Justice in Palestine is now treated the same way as the Ku Klux Klan, as they should be. Now, this is so offensive and flatly false. SJP is a pro-Palestinian student activist group. I have never seen them accused of any violence of any kind. And to claim that they put on robes and, go burn crosses, this is an offensive counterattack that has no basis in fact. I want to commend Bob Agelko. He's the legal affairs writer for the San Francisco Chronicle, and he has stayed on the case for 14 years of Rahina Ibrahim. She is a professor of architecture at a university in Malaysia. She was studying at Stanford, and at one point she was arbitrarily placed on the no-fly list. And the Supreme Court yesterday refused to take up her case, which means that the appeals court judgment stands. It showed that the FBI accidentally checked the wrong box and put Ibrahim on the no-fly list in November 2004 after an investigation had cleared her. And this shows the Kafkaesque notion of the whole no-fly list. If you're on it for the wrong reasons, you can't get off. And I am pleased to see that the Supreme Court turned down the appeal. And finally today, we say farewell and rest in peace to Congressman Elijah Cummings, a Democrat from Baltimore, who served with honor and distinction. He was an African-American activist from Maryland. He was the target of presidential tweets earlier this year about Baltimore's infestation. But I found him to be an honorable man who served his constituents and the United States with morality and a form of leadership that is now, in many cases, no longer seen. Thanks for joining me today for my News and Comment podcast. You are free to share it all over the damn place. You'll find it on YouTube. And I'm still Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.